Hey everyone, thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. We are going to be talking about XRP today. Please like and subscribe, notifications on if you guys like the content I produce. So I think this is going to be a really interesting video, and I'm going to cover some stuff I haven't really covered before. But I know a lot of people in the community are really looking for a breakout soon with Ripple, definitely against the US dollar. Maybe with respect to Bitcoin too, but definitely with respect to the US dollar. But first, we're going to go into some key graphs here, so we can really kind of get a better idea of where Ripple is with respect to where it has been historically. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in. So this first graph here shows XRP with respect to Bitcoin, and it's on a logarithmic scale. So note that. And then also I have an average here. So this average is actually the average price if you were to take the average of every single day since inception. So we're talking about, more than 5 years of data. This is the average price. And one of the things that's interesting is, while we've been above this average price and below this average price a lot, anytime we go below it, it always pops back up. And, not that that really is that significant, but it's interesting in terms of, is this a good buy-in price? Thinking about that, is around 30 cents a decent time to buy? And what's remarkable is that it's still below where we currently are, despite the fact that Ripple was at pennies on the dollar, like fractions of a penny for so long. The average price in terms of Bitcoin is still below, or we are currently below that average price with respect to Bitcoin. And obviously, Bitcoin used to be less. At one point was much less than what it is today, going back to a few cents if you go back over a decade. But still, I think it's quite remarkable that despite the fact that Ripple with respect to Bitcoin has been much lower in the past, currently we are still below the total average. So that's kind of interesting from a trying to weigh your risk management. If you were to look at this graph and we were up here, then it should give you reasonable suspicion that it should be time to sell, because anytime we've gotten up this high, we don't hold it for very long. Anytime we're around that 10 to the minus 4, it's very short-lived. I mean, you can see here it's short-lived. Here. It's not something that we've typically held for very long. Now, one of the things that is interesting is that this trend is generally going up. But let's highlight kind of where we were. So the red is time frames where we're below the average, and then the green is a time frame when we're above the average. So you can see that as we've continued to move forward in time, there's more times where we're above this average, and this obviously makes sense considering you can see these big peaks over here. And it's important to remember, because some of you might be thinking, well, of course it's like this because Ripple has increased in value, but this is not with respect to US dollar, it's with respect to Bitcoin. So with respect to Bitcoin, there's more and more times where we're actually above that average value than below it. And which obviously means that, this average is going to slowly increase as if we can pop back above it. I mean, currently, since we're below the average is actually going to be coming down until we pop above it. Now, to me, this is interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, we are currently below this average point. Is it possible we come down lower? It is. And some of you guys might be like, well, Ben, I mean, who cares about the average, right? I mean, this value of this line here was not the average when we were over here. I mean, the average would have been much lower. Well, it's a good point. So let's look at the running average. So this is the average given all previous data at that data point. So, it takes into account a lot of data, and we still have the overall average plotted on here, and you can see that the running average over time goes to the average because, of course, they must converge, because this is the same, it's all the data once you get to this point. So you can see that even with that running average, it's kind of funny how we kind of play with that running average some, and in this area, kind of finding it as support. And currently, we're still below that running average, because obviously it's the same as the average that way out here. But what's interesting is you can see there's a lot more green as we move forward in time. We used to, with respect to Bitcoin, Ripple used to have a very bearish trend. In fact, for 4 years or so, 3 to 4 years, it would have made much more sense in general to keep your money in Bitcoin than in XRP. But in recent years, that trend has started to shift some. And I think if you're invested in Ripple, all the things they're doing. Back in these days, they didn't really have nearly as much going on as they do now. You have so many banks picking it up, I think it really could become adopted by a lot of these banks that are wanting to send cross-border payments and whatever it might be. So the interesting thing is, for me, looking at this type of a graph, it kind of can help manage what your risk is when you're investing in an asset. I've made several videos for several different coins, but I don't show all of my analysis in any given video, but I run these types of analyses for a lot of different coins to see, when are good times to invest and when might it be better to hold off. So for me, you clearly don't want to be investing up here. This is dumb money coming in. If you're investing up here, it's dumb money. If you're investing down here, it's pretty much been smart money, because even if you invested, say, at this point before this huge downtrend, it was only a matter of time before you were in the positive with respect to Bitcoin. It's always any time this has happened, every time we've gone below that running average, it's only been a matter of time before we pop back above it, and that time frame changes. The amount of time it takes to get back above it, changes. Over here, we're kind of going back and forth, and then we had this long bear trend, and then a bull trend, followed by I'm sure a lot of you guys probably remember this. It was very confusing as to why it just kept going down. But the interesting thing is, when it gets this low, that's when it typically spikes up very quickly. So I've mentioned before that, you want to be, and obviously these aren't drawn perfectly because this kind of goes above it right here, but it's red over this entire range. But you want to be careful about when you exit, your Ripple position if you haven't seen one of these spikes, because every single time in the past we've seen a spike at some point, which allows us to be in this green zone. Now, another thing I want to point out that it's possible that we shoot up higher next time. We used to be kind of down in this range over here where the maximum was 10 to the minus 4, and then we jumped up, from 10 to the minus 4 to 2 times 10 to the minus 4, which is actually, that's pretty significant when you're talking about this logarithmic scale. Going from here to here is pretty significant. So keep in mind that, we might continue this upward trajectory where we slowly gain on Bitcoin. But in general, we're going to be looking to see a huge ripple, as I like to say, in the price. And it's always impossible to say exactly when they're going to happen. Historically, these price moves occur when Bitcoin either reaches an all-time high or after it's kind of plateaued at a peak in a bull cycle, and that's when Ripple will have these huge run-ups in price. So you could go ahead and invest in Ripple now, because obviously we're not sure exactly what will happen, but it could be that the next huge spike would come once Bitcoin gets back to $20,000. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to keep going up. You can see over here, we held this uptrend for half a year before we saw this huge spike. So something similar could happen. We could continue to gain ground for quite a while before a huge spike. Another possibility is we could lose ground. But no matter whether we gain it or lose it, they've always historically been followed by a huge spike, which was usually around 10x with respect to Bitcoin. So you don't want to miss those those movements in the future. So just bear that in mind. So I want to quickly jump into the more traditional graphs because I think it's very interesting. We've talked about these golden crosses and death crosses and how they've compared with Bitcoin. If you look at Bitcoin on the daily chart, as I've mentioned before, it had a golden cross and it had death cross. And the funny thing is not all altcoins are showing this trend. So some of you have probably heard me talk about this trend before. But there's actually a significant number of altcoins that aren't doing this, and they're never going to return back to their all-time high, just because there's no use for them. But what's interesting with Bitcoin, is it had, after this long bear market, it had that golden cross and then a death cross, and then that second golden cross is where things took off. And as I've talked about before with Ripple, we had that golden cross, that death cross, and now we're curling up, and we're actually holding this 50-day moving average as support, which is a really good sign because if we were to, if you could imagine us just continuing this trend out here, and let's say we just somehow continue this trend, we're going to have our next golden cross, in about a month and a half. It could be sooner if this price continues to move up quicker, then it could be within a month or so. So we're going to keep a close eye on that. The interesting thing with Ripple though is the last time it was in this accumulation phase after this bear market, it actually had another cross, and in fact, if we let's see, it's over here. If we zoom in on this bear market, sorry. You can see, this, we had several of these crosses. So you can see we had this golden cross, and then a death cross, and a golden cross, and then a death cross, until finally we had this golden cross, which is when we really took off. So, I think these types of accumulation periods that you can see over here and over here, they're really decent times, in my opinion. Not that this is financial advice, but they're really decent times to start accumulating an asset in the crypto space because, to me, this shows a very strong sign of strength. That, it's even bouncing off that 200-day moving average over here with respect to the dollar. Obviously, it didn't do that over here, but it's interesting because, it shows strength. We're not just seeing this downward trend that lasts forever like it does with some altcoins. So currently, we have seen a golden cross and a death cross. We'll probably print another golden cross in about a month or so, assuming this trend continues, which I think there's a good chance that it will. It's somewhat dubious to say that we're going to take off. It always depends on really where Bitcoin is in its cycle. So currently with Bitcoin, if you look at the week, the moving averages on the week time frame, so the 200 week and the 50 week. You can see that, and I should also add the that 20-week moving average. Let me go ahead and add this 20-week moving average. So as I've mentioned before, the 20-week is held as support in a bull market, whereas Bitcoin is currently holding it as resistance. So we need to get above that 20-week. Once we get above the 20-week, I think there's a good case that the altcoin season is not too far away, if you want to think of it like that. Because historically, once Bitcoin kind of holds that key level of support, then altcoins that are worthwhile will then take off afterwards. So like after Bitcoin has gone on a run and then it's stabilized at a really positive support, really bullish support, and that's when altcoins will really have their heyday. So we would like to get above this 20-week moving average. So currently it's at around $9,800. And when we had this recent run with Bitcoin where it went up like $1,000 really quickly, it actually, or even went up more than $1,000, went up like $2,000 in a day or something. We actually held that 20-week as resistance. So keep that in mind. Now, the interesting thing is that if you were to look on the weekly time scale for Ripple Bitcoin, or sorry, for Bitcoin versus US dollar, if you look at the 50-week and the 200-week moving averages, so this is the 50-week, this is the 200-week, once they were squeezed together like this, they never crossed. In fact, it was once they got to that point, that's when Bitcoin broke out. Now let's look at what Ripple's doing on that weekly time frame. Looks pretty similar, doesn't it? The 50 week and the 200 week are being squeezed together right now. And recently we came up and we held that 50 week as resistance. But if we continue this trend on the daily chart, then I think we're going to continue our slow uptrend and print this golden cross, which would more or less correspond with these potentially coming together. You can imagine that if we were to draw this out, then it might look something like that. And then if we were to draw this one out, it might look something like this or something. This is just vague. And you can see that would also correspond in early December, which is when this golden cross might be occurring. So we're going to keep a close eye on what Bitcoin's doing. I think Ripple is a great asset because I think it's one of the easier cryptos to trade. There's a lot of other cryptocurrencies that I think are worth investing in. But Ripple's nice because it's been around so long. It's been around since 2013, so there's a lot of data. You can see that it has stood the test of time, and it's been around a long time, and it's had these cycles. And historically, if you ever invested in Ripple during this time, then you were usually rewarded. In fact, every single time you're rewarded. Okay guys, that is it for this video. Please like and subscribe with notifications on, and we'll see you next time.